I'm Doug Cuny and this is my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make rye bread. At the time we're recording this video, we're coming up on the Christmas holidays. And at my house that means Reuben sandwiches. And one of the integral parts of a really good Reuben sandwich is good rye bread. So I'm going to show you how to fix hearth-style rye bread. Hearth-style bread is different than loaf bread that's made in a pan. It's a more highly hydrated bread, and it's baked in the oven on a flat, hot surface, so it's one of the round loaves, and as it bakes, it develops a nice crust on it. Now in my case, if I'm going to make one loaf of bread, I might as well make two. And my oven is actually big enough to get two Dutch ovens in at one time. So rather than just making one loaf, I'm going to make two. And by making two, it kind of rounds off the math you have to do. So if you decide that you want to make only one loaf, take the measurements that I give you and cut them in half and then go from there. Another thing to remember is that you can use this recipe to make several different types of bread. I'll be making rye bread, but if you want to eliminate the rye flour and another addition that I put in it and just use bread flour, you can make a regular white loaf. If you want to use a combination of white bread flour and whole wheat flour, you can make a whole wheat loaf. So keep in mind that you can mix and match and come up with several different types of bread from this one recipe. Also, this is a naturally leavened bread. You're not using commercial yeast to make this. So in order to leaven the bread, you're going to have a starter to begin with. And if you don't know what a starter is, then you need to either get a starter or watch my video on making your own bread starter. Now what we're making here is what I call fresh bread or a fresh loaf. If you watched my videos on making sourdough, you know that necessarily the rise times and the rest periods are very extended. And just to recap here, the reason for that is natural bread, naturally fermented bread, ferments. It goes through chemical processes. One of the first things that it does during the fermentation process is it develops lactic acid, which is one of the flavor components that we associate with fresh bread. That's that real pungent, wonderful smell that you smell. After it uses up a certain amount of the available food in the flour, it starts producing acetic acid. And acetic acid is the active flavor component in vinegar. And the longer you ferment it within reason, the more acetic acid builds up. And as the acetic acid builds up, you get a sour flavor. That's the reason that sourdough bread ferments for so much longer than what I call sweet or fresh bread. So in this case, we're going to use shorter fermentation times, and we're going to produce fresh or sweet loaf. And if you've made the sourdough bread, you'll notice that there is quite a difference in flavor. The thing that amazes most people is the fact that the ingredients in both sweet bread or fresh bread and sourdough bread are exactly the same thing. We didn't use a different culture. We don't use different ingredients. It's simply a matter of how long it's fermented. So let's cover what you're going to need. You're going to need a scale. You're going to need various size bowls. A spatula would be helpful. A bread spatula would come in very handy. Also, if you don't already have a bench scraper, you're going to want to find one. They're not very expensive. You can usually find them in most household departments. You're going to need sea salt. Make sure it's not iodized salt. You'll need kitchen parchment paper. You'll need plastic wrap. For this recipe, you're going to use cocoa powder. You're going to need a heavy Dutch oven with a tight-fitting lid. You're going to need filtered water because municipal water tends to have additives that can damage the culture that ferments your bread. And finally, you're going to need bread starter. If you need more information, check out my video on Naturally-Leavened bread starter. Alright, for this recipe, I'm going to make 2 500-gram loaves of rye bread. So I'm going to be making a total of 1,000 grams of dry ingredients, meaning flour in this case. So it makes the math very easy. If you watch the video on making sourdough bread, you know that your leaven made from your starter is optimally supposed to be about 20% the volume of your dry ingredients. So if I'm making 2 500-gram loaves, total of 1,000 grams, then I need 200 grams of leaven. Now usually, if I'm not baking bread every day, I'll keep my starter in the refrigerator and then make a new batch, feed it once a week. And this, I set out last night to bring it up to room temperature. And if you look closely, it's absolutely full of air bubbles. Carbon dioxide bubbles, actually. And so this is ripe and ready to be used. So I'll show you how to make your leaven. Now in this case, because we're making 1,000 grams of dry flour, we're going to make a bread with 1,000 grams of dry flour. 20% would be 200, so we need 200 grams of leaven. That would mean 100 grams of flour mixture and 100 grams of filtered water. Now in this case I'm doing 50 grams of bread flour and 50 grams of rye flour, even though that's not the mixture that I'm going to use for the final bread mixture. Seeing that this is only 20% of the final bread mixture, for ease of execution, I'm going with a 50-50 mix. You can match it to your final mixture if you want, but for this, I'm just going to make it easy. So we're going to put in 50 grams of rye flour, 50 grams of the white bread flour. We're going to mix that up. And then here I have 100 grams of filtered water, which we'll mix with this. But the easiest way to do it is to put the starter in the water and dissolve it before you add it to the flour mixture. So usually you figure about a tablespoon of starter per 100 grams of leaven. Now it doesn't have to be real exact, just kind of get close. So I'm going to call that 2 tablespoons. I'll set the starter to the side. And then you just get right in here and you break up your starter, which will aid with the mixing of the dry ingredients. That's good enough. Now we'll add the water in the starter. And we'll mix our dry and wet ingredients. So what we're doing here is we're taking that live culture that was in the starter. We're adding a little of that to our flour mixture and our water mixture. And essentially, we're feeding the starter. We're giving that starter something to feed on. It will start feeding on this fresh flour mixture and start to ferment. And then when we mix this with our final bread mixture, what we're doing is essentially just stepping this up from just a little bit of starter to a larger quantity of leaven, and then the leaven will act as the starter did for the leaven with the bread. So now we've got enough to leaven our bread when we get ready to mix the bread up. And that's looking real good. So, I don't think you can really see a close look at this. But you'll notice what the texture is like. It's very stiff. It's actually a medium dough. It's not runny, but it's not soft either. And that's the way it is when you first mix it. Now over a period of time, as it ferments, you'll notice that it will get softer and much stickier, and it will fill with bubbles given off by the fermentation process. So, there's our leaven. That's finished. Now we'll leave this to rise and develop, and then we'll move on to our next step. Now, a word of advice here. Yeah, this is science to an extent, but people have been doing this for thousands of years. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I've been making bread for years, and sometimes there are factors that you just simply can't control. The barometric pressure, that sort of thing. You can make the perfect loaf every time for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then you'll have guests coming over and you bake bread for them, and as you're baking bread, a low pressure front will come through your area and the bread just won't rise. So things like that happen. Flour is relatively inexpensive, so don't be afraid to make mistakes. If you have something that really doesn't work out, a loaf that just doesn't rise, don't worry about it. Kind of keep records, analyze what might have happened, ask questions, and experiment, and start again.